Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name's Alisha and today I'm going to be doing a book talk slash book review of a book that I recently finished and just absolutely love and just really wanted to gush about, and that is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker-Chan. So this is a adult historical fantasy and it's just absolutely brilliant, and let's get into it. So starting off, this book is basically a gender-bent reimagining of the rise of the Ming Dynasty. So after and during reading this book, I really not only was able to learn from the book itself about history and the things that the book was talking about, but I was just so interested in what actually happened in the real world that I went and did some research on my own, and I really love when books can do that. But basically what I found out was that the Ming Dynasty is one of the older dynasties that was China was a part of. And so this was around the 14th century where the Mongolian Empire had taken control of China as well as a lot of parts of Asia, as well as into the Middle East and Europe, places like Russia. And so the Mongolian Empire was actually a really brutal and ruthless empire. They weren't really good to the people and they didn't really take care of the people. So there are a lot of problems in this empire. And at a certain point, this kind of uprising and rebel groups came up to take back control. And so basically what this book is looking at is the kind of near the end of the Mongolian Empire, I would say, but it is this one kind of, I think like a faction or area of the Mongolian Empire called the Yuan, I guess, Empire Dynasty, and they are in this book against the rebel group who are trying to take down the Mongolian Empire, especially in China. So this book is really looking at that part of history, and the really cool thing that I think it does is that in our real history, the Ming Dynasty was founded basically by a young boy who was an orphan and grew up really poor and made his own way through the ranks basically to get to a point where he was able to take control and take back power and create the Ming Dynasty. But what this book does is it has a girl who basically Mulan style pretends to be a boy and kind of does the same thing that the real real history what that boy does. So it's this gender bent retelling of that whole situation. So basically that idea of turning history on its head basically and having a girl be what this man in our history was able to do, I think was such a cool and interesting twist. I think it really propelled the story in a way that if this was just a generic, retelling with a boy at the center of the story, the story wouldn't have been able to do. And I think through having this gender bent reimagining, the author was really able to hone in on different themes and ideas that otherwise she wouldn't have been able to, such as gender identity and the kind of role of women and men in society, and things like honor and how kind of men see their role in I guess politics and also battle and violence and things like that, and how that is seen, I guess, in men and women in these kind of war times. So I think all of those things just were so great in the story. Then moving on to the writing in this book, I think this author, as I think this is her debut book, but her writing was really kind of easy to read, and I mean that in a really good way, because sometimes with fantasy books you can get really carried away in really flowery and descriptive writing, which makes it harder to actually grasp what's going on in a book, I feel. But I think this author did a really good job of kind of keeping that balance between having flowery and beautiful writing, but also keeping it kind of straightforward and to the point so you're not too lost in the actual writing, so that you can't focus on the story and the characters and things like that. As well as, actually, I think a cool thing that the author did was when we start off the book, we are kind of it feels like we're set apart from the characters and we're just getting this really bird's eye view of these characters, like feelings and their intentions and what they're going through. And especially at the start of the book, we really only focus on one character, specifically who's the main character. And then as we go further along in the story, we kind of get more into the character's psyche and why they're doing what they're doing and the choices they're making and the situations they're in, and also kind of expanding whose narration we're kind of seeing. So we do get introduced to the perspectives of a few other characters, which I also think was a really cool choice of the author, because you know, if this book was told solely through one perspective, I don't think it would have added as much as it does while we're giving all these other perspectives, if that makes sense. But overall, I think the writing was great and really made the story enjoyable and easily digestible. So moving on to the plot, I did kind of go over my feelings on the plot and what the book was about, but just to reiterate, I loved, I think, the main part of the plot, which was this gender bent idea, and I think that really made the plot much more interesting, I guess. And then referring to my notes, so if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. But yeah, so I did talk about how much history was packed into this book, and I don't like, obviously this is not a history book, like you're not going to learn exactly how the history unfolded because of reading this book, but like I said at the start, like just the fact that I was so interested based on what I was reading here that I went out to like just do my own little research of what actually happened. I think that's so cool when books can do that. And then actually talking about what was included in the plot. So I think obviously this is a book about two different political sides. There's like this rebel group and then the group that's actually in charge, and obviously the rebels are trying to take down that group. So you're gonna get a lot of battle scenes and kind of war and political talk. So I would say if you're really interested in political intrigue and kind of strategy and things like that, this book had a huge deal of that, and I actually enjoyed those things, versus the actual kind of fighting and the battle scenes, I guess. So there are some kind of gruesome scenes, but they're not like overly descriptive. So if you're worried about like gore and things, it's not too bad in this book. But I would say that when those battle scenes came up and like the fighting and the violence and things, it wasn't really the focus of those scenes. It was more about what the kind of opposing sides were feeling and their strategy and their situation, I guess, and then how the actual outcome of those battles impacted the characters. So you're not really gonna get a huge deal of descriptive scenes of like fights and army and battle and things like that. And then obviously, as I said, this is a fantasy book, and I would say the fantasy aspects are very relevant to the story, but I don't think it's over, like there's not really like a magic system or like things like that. It is pretty rooted in, I would say, like the real world. Like this is obviously a historical fantasy, so we are in this world, and the kind of fantasy parts are more, I would say, like actual kind of cultural magic, if that makes sense. So it has to do with the kind of, I guess, like culture and religion that the book surrounds or like is about. So it does talk about like Buddhism and some kind of, I want to say, like shamanism or divine right. So it has a character who is a, I think, prince, but it's like the mandate of heaven. So it's talking about like divine right and how these kind of godly powers or like prophecies are given to humans and things like that, if that makes sense. So yeah, you don't really have people with magic, so that's not really a fantasy aspect of the story, but it is still a fantasy book. And then lastly, my other point about the plot is that the marketing of this book is definitely a Mulan meets the Song of Achilles, and like, as it's pretty clear, the Mulan comparison is obvious. Obviously, like the main character is a girl pretending to be a boy to be able to do what men were able to do at those times. But the Song of Achilles, I think, is more relevant to a specific part of the book and specific characters. It's not really like an overarching theme. So if you're going to this book thinking that it's like a Song of Achilles type book, it's not. Like, it's not really the focus of it. But that the part that is compared to, or at least that I'm comparing it to, is really like heartbreaking and heart-wrenching, and you're definitely going to be in your feels about it. So moving on to the characters, our first main character is Zhu Shangba. So this is the character that when she's young, she is really poor, and her basically all her family dies from a famine and their circumstances, and so all that she has left is her father and her brother. And so her father takes both children to this kind of fortune teller, shaman type person, and basically he tells her brother that he is destined to be great. And then he tells her, as kind of this afterthought, that she's destined to be nothing. And so her father dies from these bandits who try to kind of steal from them. And so once her father is dead, her and her brother are orphans. And then her brother kind of can't handle being an orphan and kind of his fate of being great. Like, he isn't ready to take that on. And so he ends up dying too. And so now Zhu is by herself. And so she decides that she wants to survive, and she's kind of willing to do anything to survive. And so she decides she's going to steal her brother's identity and in that steal his fate. And so she is going to be the one who is fated to be great, or so that is her choosing that. And so she works her way kind of through life on this sole motivation that she's going to survive, and she is not going to accept this fate of being nothing. And so then she suffers and she perseveres, and she kind of raises herself through the ranks of life. She goes and becomes a monk at this monastery, and then she ends up being in the rebel army group and goes through the ranks of that to become a general, and I think like a commissioner, or whatever the title is, but she raises her way to the top basically only on the sole motivation that she's going to survive and she's going to be great. And at a certain point, she kind of decides that she can be great. Not only will she not be nothing, but she will be great. So basically, I think that's such an interesting idea, and it really allows for this character to be such a well-rounded character in a way. And because of this, because of these motivations and these desires that she has and what she's kind of willing to do to make sure that she does survive, she doesn't always make the best decisions. And a lot of times she doesn't really care how her decisions affect other people, because her like one main goal is to survive and to be great, and she knows that she can be great. So I think it's interesting, and she really becomes this really morally gray character where you might be able to understand her decisions and why she does the things that she does, even if you don't agree with them. And I really love characters like that. I think it's so fascinating to read about and to kind of understand their side and get their perspective, and kind of feel for them while also not agreeing with them and not being okay with what they're doing. But I really loved her character, and I loved her growth and kind of her character arc, and seeing how she starts off being this completely poor orphan who kind of doesn't have any future, and how she creates her own future and creates her own destiny and achieves her goals in a way. And yeah, absolutely loved her. And then our other main character, his name is Wu Yang, and he is actually a eunuch. And so eunuchs were this really common thing in history where basically these really poor kind of slave people were castrated and taken to the kind of royal family, or castle, wherever they would be, and be forced to kind of work for the royal family. And so Wu Yang is a eunuch, and he when he was young, the Mongolian Empire and the people in charge had killed his family, and then instead of killing him, they castrated him, turning him into a eunuch, and took him to work for the royal family. And now the people he works for, and he's a general in the Mongolian Empire by force, the people he works for are the people who killed his family. And so he's had a really obviously tough childhood and upbringing and life. And so he too is a really fascinating character, really morally ambiguous, in the sense of like, kind of for most of the story, you don't really know where his loyalties lie, and you don't really know what his motivations are, and kind of like juxtaposed with Zhu, because you know exactly why Zhu is doing the things that she does. you know, whereas him, and even throughout the book, he says like we don't really get a real understanding of why he's doing what he's doing, and we just kind of know that he has his own motivations, even though they might not be apparent to all the characters. But what I thought was really fascinating was that through the idea of Yang being this eunuch, he also actually has these really feminine features, and he has this what's described as like a really beautiful woman-like face and like features. And so because of that, and because of his obviously very traumatic situation, he has this really deep kind of hatred and disgust for women. And so he treats women pretty badly, to be honest. But a lot of that is coming from the fact that, you know, what, like how he doesn't accept himself and how he sees himself. And so I thought that was really interesting, seeing this kind of struggle of identity and gender identity, and what that means for him as a person and how he treats other people. Because basically, you know, he sees himself, and I think others, you know, obviously see him like this, as he's not fully male, because of his castration and his situation, but he's also not obviously fully female because, you know, he just has these features, or he's kind of in this in-between place, and that's how people see him, and because of that they treat him pretty badly. And so I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it started this really great conversation about gender identity. And I forgot to mention, but also with Sue, because honestly for most of her life, I think when she was 8 or 10 or something, that's when she started pretending to be a male, to be able to get her way through society. So she kind of doesn't really see herself as a woman. She doesn't really see these feminine features in herself, or even these kind of woman-like instincts of like maternal instincts or empathy and things like that. And so she too kind of struggles with her gender identity and how she sees herself. And so I thought those were really cool and really well written discussions that were being had within the book, but also made you think and kind of understand how these people were feeling and these characters were feeling. And then moving on a bit to like some relationships in the book. So I thought, so there were two kind of main relationships, one of them being between Yang and Essen, who was the prince of the Mongolian Empire. And so Yang throughout his kind of life has had these kind of subtle feelings for Essen, and he doesn't really, I like, it wasn't clearly indicated in the book how he felt, but you could tell that, you know, he had feelings of jealousy, attraction, and things like that. And so they all kind of come to this boiling point towards the end of the book, where Yang makes this decision that is honestly just absolutely heartbreaking. And again, like, you really understand and you feel for him, even if you don't agree with what he did, because I really didn't. But there was this, yeah, this relationship. So I think that relationship, early when I mentioned the comparisons to the Song of Achilles, I think that relationship was kind of the situation that was being compared. And it definitely is heartbreaking, and it's definitely gonna make you cry and make you sad and make you feel a lot of emotions. But I really did find that relationship interesting. And the other main relationship was between Zhu and this character named Ma. So Ma is this kind of really traditional woman, and is basically forced into this role that women are supposed to have in this time, in this period of society. And so she is constantly having, like, she doesn't really have a voice for herself. She is just supposed to, you know, get married, have kids, and that's her life. Until she meets Sue, who basically tells her that it's okay to have desires and it's okay to have wants, and that she should be her own person. And so she ends up falling in love with Sue, and Sue falls in love with her. And Ma actually doesn't know that Sue is a woman. And so there's this whole love story going on with them. And I thought it was super cute and really well developed. And I think having these two characters be kind of total opposites, because you have Zhu, who is kind of really selfish and only really cares about herself and, you know, where she wants to get herself in life, whereas Ma, who is, especially at the start of the book, starts off being really selfless and really empathetic and really understanding of other people, and kind of seeing herself as not her own person. And then through this relationship, both of them are able to kind of understand each other. So Zu is able to slowly become a little more empathetic, and then Ma is able to have her own voice and have her own desires and act on those desires. And then towards the end, I mean, the way this book ends is crazy, but it really kind of solidified that whole situation of the role of women, because Ma ends up making a lot of sacrifices for her, like because of her love for Zu and because of her wanting to support Zu and be there for Zu, whereas Zu still is like, I need to climb to the top and I need to be, you know, achieve my greatness. And so the decisions that Zu makes really affect Ma kind of negatively and kind of causes, I think, some tension in the relationship. And I'm hoping we really delve into that in the next book, because it just ends on such a interesting note, this book, and it really impacts their relationship. But overall, I really liked their relationship, and I loved the kind of growth and character arc of Ma, as well as the development and growth in that relationship. So then quickly, just to touch on some of the themes, some of these I have already discussed, but the first theme I think for sure is the idea of gender identity and just identity in general. But you have the character of Zu, who, due to her choices of being this male and pretending to be a man as she grows up and pushes her way through society, she kind of becomes distant from being a woman, and because of that she is kind of in this no man's land of, she doesn't really know what she like, what she feels like and what she is. And so she doesn't feel fully female because she hasn't really connected with that side of her, but she also doesn't feel male because she knows that she's not a male and that she would be treated and seen differently if people knew that she was actually a girl. So that I think was really interesting, and I think obviously with Uyang's storyline of his like disgust and hatred for himself and how that is portrayed, especially towards other women, and how that makes him feel towards himself and other people, and his kind of struggle with his gender identity. So that was a huge part of the book. And then I think another really prominent theme is the idea of destiny and fate, because obviously, as I've discussed, Zu really is motivated by her fight and perseverance of this fate that isn't truly hers. And so this idea of her kind of fighting for what she thinks she deserves, because, you know, she was told that she was going to be nothing and that was her destiny, but she decided that she just wasn't going to accept that and that she wanted more out of her life. And I think you can really see that too with how she makes Ma believe that, and makes Ma believe that she too can have a destiny that is bigger than what she thought she could have. And then also with the characters of the Prince of Radiance and the kind of Mandate of Heaven. So these are not really character, well, Mandate of Heaven is not a character, but just these ideas of like, there's this divine right and these mandates that are written, you know, for you before you're even born, you know, and then how much kind of free will do you have in your own destiny? Can you change your destiny, or is it just written for you? And so obviously I think Zu's character does a really interesting job of really turning that on its head and making you question, like, is fate something that you have control over, or can you change it? So those are my overall thoughts on this book. I absolutely loved it, and it honestly might be one of my favorite books of 2021. If it wasn't obvious, I gave it 5 stars, and I think you will absolutely love it if you love a good historical fantasy. You love some political intrigue, character-driven plots, some heartbreak, some amazing writing, some beautiful moments, and some great kind of conversation and discussion starters. Overall, this book was just so amazing, and I think you most definitely should check it out and you should read it. Thanks so much for checking out this video, and see you guys next time.